Do you leave every doctor's appointment with more prescriptions and referrals and also more questions? Oh, friend, you're in the right place. I'm Kayla, registered nurse and personal medical strategist, and here every week we're going to work together to cut through the noise, connect the dots, and finally get you the real plan you deserve. Let's dive in. Hi, welcome back. Today is a very special episode of the podcast. I'm really excited to share this with you. This is going to be a visual experience a little bit. So if you are listening, first of all, did you know, fun fact, this is actually a video podcast and available on YouTube. However, if you're an audio only person, I get it. I live and die by Spotify. I will do my best to explain what I'm talking about, and what is going to be shown on the screen. You should still get the impact. As we're moving through, even if you're not watching the video. But today I'm going to be unpacking what is in a medical roadmap because it's a question I get all the time. And up until this point, I've really never had a good answer for that. And if you'd really like to follow along with this video, I suggest that you go to herdforlife.com/see, that's SEE, as in see with your own eyes, what you get in a medical roadmap. So, without any further ado, what do I actually get in a medical roadmap? Or what are you going to do for me if I book one? These are some of the top questions that I get. And like I said, I've never really had a good answer because unlike the doctor's office, which is driven by one-size-fits-all protocols, every medical roadmap that Herd for Life does is completely individual. It's built around your unique medical situation, including the unexplained pieces and the realities of your life, your finances, your support system, work, preferences, like whether you lean toward or away pharmaceuticals, and even your level of medical skepticism is taken into consideration. So we don't hand you a template. We actually co-create a plan that works with your reality. But we're not just winging it either. You see, every client goes through our restorative care cycle, which is a 5-step framework that I developed after more than a decade at the bedside, watching what actually helps people get better and what keeps them stuck in cycles of worsening symptoms. Coupling that framework with our radically individualized plan is how we consistently move people from endless appointments and no answers to finally uncovering what's really going on. But here's the challenge. That individualized approach is the magic. And it's also what makes it hard for someone considering this service to picture exactly what they'll get. That's exactly why I can't answer that question just right off of the bat, because it's one of those things that it's kind of like taking a car to a mechanic and you just roll up with a few problems and say, all right, what are you going to do? The mechanic's not going to be able to tell you until they take a look under the hood. And it's similar here. Um, but my goal is to change that by walking you through a real case so you can see firsthand how we took that mess and synthesize it into something that makes sense. So I'm going to tell you about a client. Details and names, of course, changed for privacy. And for our intents and purposes today, we'll call her Sarah. So Sarah was in her late 40s, living a life she loved, working, caring for her family, planning her next vacation. But honestly, pretty suddenly, everything collapsed. She developed debilitating headaches, crushing fatigue, and blood pressure readings so low, her doctors told her it was a wonder that she could even stand. Within months, she had to give up work, lost the ability to drive, and her world pretty much shrank to 4 walls and a bed. So, of course, she did what anyone would do. She went to the doctor. She saw a neurologist for her headaches, a cardiologist for her blood pressure. She had test after test, including an MRI of her brain. Everything came back normal except the blood pressure readings. Her doctors assumed that she'd maybe become too sensitive to the blood pressure medications that she'd been on for a decade. So they stopped her medications. And when her pressures were still low, they actually then prescribed drugs to raise her pressure. And when that didn't work, they doubled the dose. Despite their best efforts and Sarah's full compliance with this routine, she only got worse. She was terrified that this was going to be her new normal way of life. Like every client, Sarah began working with Heard for Life through the medical roadmap process, which starts with step 1 and 2 of our restorative care cycle: assess and discover. In that 90-minute deep dive session, I describe it like this. It's almost like you show up with a bag of 1,000 medical puzzle pieces, but no picture on the box. And so together we dump it all out and start to see the patterns emerge. We dig deep, we ask why again and again, and pull every thread. And that's when clients often share things they never realized were important. About an hour into this session, Sarah casually mentioned to me that sometimes she had this whooshing sound in her ears. I wasn't sure what to make of it initially until I asked her if it matched her heartbeat. And she thought about it for a minute and she said yes. Now, as a trained clinician, I knew right away that did not fit the symptoms of low blood pressure. If her pressure were truly as low as the number suggested, she shouldn't hear her heartbeat at all. We didn't know it yet, but that tiny detail would prove pivotal in her case. I call this an aha moment. Nearly every client has one, a symptom that they didn't think mattered, or a side effect they hadn't mentioned, or sometimes it's a piece of history that's just been forgotten about. But that overlooked clue often changes everything. This is the power in our deep dive approach, creating the time and space to surface and examine details that usually get rushed past or brushed aside. Over and over, we've seen that with complex or mystery medical conditions, it's often the smallest overlooked detail that unlocks the path to real answers. You see, modern medicine has more treatments and breakthroughs than ever, thanks to research and specialization. But the other side of that is it's created a kind of tunnel vision. And unless you have a provider who is explicitly connecting all your conditions and symptoms, you must assume that no one is, unfortunately. Each provider focuses only on their piece of the body. And if you share something that doesn't fit their working diagnosis, like Sarah's whooshing sound, often they assume that it's related to something else and therefore someone else's problem to solve. That's how people get stuck, bouncing from specialist to specialist with symptoms that don't improve and questions that never get answered. Our role isn't to magically know the diagnosis, but it is to recognize when pieces don't add up, flag the details that could change everything, and make sure those get put in front of a doctor in a way that can't be ignored. Now, before I show you Sarah's actual medical roadmap, I do want to pause and give you a little context because up until this point, I've focused on the main part of her story, the headaches, fatigue, and blood pressure, because I wanted to show you her whole story very clearly. But if you really look at her medical roadmap, you're going to notice that there's other details woven into her situation. Those pieces don't make it into the short version of the story, just simply for clarity. But they absolutely mattered in building her plan. And that's kind of the whole point, because in real life, people don't just show up with one problem in a vacuum. If they did, Well, we probably wouldn't be having this conversation because then your medical journey wouldn't be nearly as complex as it actually is. Everything comes with layers. Uh, Thankfully, through our process, the medical roadmap captures all of it, organizes it, and most importantly, makes sure none of it gets lost or dismissed. Okay, so let's start with the very first section of Sarah's roadmap. And this is the same format for all roadmaps, by the way. So this is the overview of the situation. The purpose of this section is really simple. It captures the entire story in one clear, easy to digest snapshot. This is powerful because most of my clients, like Sarah, have been through years of scattered appointments, multiple specialists, and stacks of test results. It's overwhelming. And this overview pulls all of those puzzle pieces into a single coherent summary. This is useful for the client and family in a couple of ways. So, first of all, being able to take that very overwhelming nebulous of all of the stuff that's happening to you and have it boiled down into something that makes sense and you can read and digest helps to strip away some of that overwhelm before we've even made any progress in the medical journey. But the other way that it's helpful is that moving forward, I always encourage my clients to take this document with them to appointments. And it gives them a script they can read off when they do have to introduce themselves and their story to a new provider, and they no longer feel like they have to ramble or stumble over words. It's just all right here, very clearly laid out. Um, so for Sarah, this is what it looked like. We laid out her main symptoms, the severe fatigue, debilitating headaches, blood pressure readings that didn't make any sense. We made sure that we noted the recent changes in medications, her history of high blood pressure, and the reality that her function had become so limiting. This section is always about clarity, and it is the foundation of the rest of what we build in the roadmap. The next section is called Important Factors to Keep in Mind when Making Decisions. The purpose here is to highlight the risks, patterns, or complicating factors that could easily get overlooked in the rush of appointments. Think of it like guardrails, the reminders that keep the care plan from veering off course. You can see in Sarah's case that there's notes about the blood pressure mismatch, the medication risks. She was on two medications that were putting her at risk in different ways, the autoimmune connections, which hadn't been followed up on, and the different areas of her fragmented care. The point of this section isn't to provide all of the answers, but just to surface the critical context so that everyone involved in the care has their eyes open to this and it can't be ignored. For Sarah, these were the landmines that had to be kept front and center as we worked towards answers. The next section of the roadmap is called action steps. The number of action steps and what those action steps are is, of course, determined by the individual's situation. I had a very complicated person who actually had six sections of action items, but three is typically what I see. Um, this is where the strategy shifts from theorizing and summary to, okay, how do we actually move forward? We create clear, prioritized checklists of next steps so that our clients know exactly what to do and in what order. By the way, I just realized I didn't say this specifically yet. But at the beginning of this, I mentioned our 5-step restorative care cycle and how the 90-minute deep dive, where we harness all of this information, is those first two steps, assess and discover. You see, after we take those steps as the strategists with the clients, the strategist, myself, then sit down and sort through all of the information, for lack of a better way. Thinking back to that metaphor of the jigsaw puzzle, This is the time where you've got all of the pieces, but now we're grouping them by color and, here's the corners and the edges and that kind of thing. So sitting and grouping them out, it does take quite a bit of time to really think through an entire client's situation and be able to boil it down into something this clear and step by step. This document, which we do call your medical strategy, that is the result of all of that discussion and synthesis. So, this is the result of step three, which is strategize in our restorative care cycle. Um, so, going back to Sarah's document, her action steps. In her situation, her issues could be broken into three sections. The first was clarifying blood pressure and vascular risk. We knew her blood pressure readings simply didn't match her actual symptoms, and that mismatch was a huge red flag for me. So the priority was getting her doctor to dig deeper, not just looking at the numbers on a cuff, but whether a blood vessel problem of some sort could actually be the real cause. You'll notice as we scroll down that there's an appointment script at the end of her roadmap to guide that conversation with her primary care provider. The second section was about addressing her pain safely. For those listening, we haven't talked about her pain that much, but if you do go to herdforlife.com/C and actually look at this plan, that was a part of her story. So we addressed some challenges here with her current pain regimen and talked about physical therapy, pain management referral, and making sure rheumatology revisited her history of autoimmune markers. Again, there's another appointment script at the end designed to help her raise those issues clearly and strategically with the rheumatology team. Section three was about investigating her liver and blood work concerns. She had elevated enzymes and abnormal platelets that had been kind of brushed aside up until this point. Now, of course, at this time, I didn't feel like that was probably the main driver of what was going on with her. But your liver clearly is important. And so that's one of the things we do with the medical roadmap is make sure that we are not only focusing on the immediate crisis at hand, but making sure that nothing gets put on the back burner long enough that it becomes a crisis of its own. That's why it was section three, not section one. Um, so we worked up a plan with next steps from that. You can see here that none of this is about throwing spaghetti at the wall. This is creating a targeted step-by-step plan with priority action items under each, so that she could finally make sense of all the chaos. Sarah and her family were able to look at this list and know exactly what to do next without the overwhelm of trying to connect all those dots themselves. The power of this section is in the clarity and direction it provides. So right here, we move on to where we go from here. We summarize it all up. We give a list of top priorities before the next check-in. Sarah is a client who had decided in advance she did not want a one-time relationship. She wanted to continue working with us. An advantage in that is that instead of trying to cram everything into one strategy document, which I knew would be overwhelming, we were able to focus on the priority, make note of the things that needed to be followed up on in the future so that it doesn't get forgotten, but without overwhelming her with everything. What exactly do I mean by that? If we look under section three, where we were talking about the liver and blood work, there's actually parts where I recommend that she reaches out to GI or hematology and makes an appointment with GI hepatology and also makes an appointment with hematology and talk to a pharmacist. Had I provided her with scripts for all of those things all at one time, it probably would have taken this document, which currently is very useful, and turned it into something overwhelming. So it's ideal when we have people who know that they want that long-term relationship. That helps to cut out that overwhelm by not trying to shove it all into one document. Before we wrap this up, I want to point out the last piece of Sarah's roadmap here, and it's the appointment scripts that I had flipped to briefly earlier. These are designed so that our clients never have to walk into an appointment wondering how to explain themselves or what to ask. These scripts give the exact language to use in the order that helps their providers really listen. And every client who works with Heard for Life gets these tailored appointment scripts as part of their medical roadmap and in our ongoing service packages as well. If you look closely, you'll actually see that both scripts follow the same framework. And this is what we call our breadcrumb method. It's a structured way of guiding conversations with providers, starting with curiosity, then narrowing in with patterns, naming the category, and finally pointing to the next step as a question. The power of this method is that it frames concerns in a way that doesn't trigger ego or defensiveness and instead opens the door to possibility so that providers stay engaged and our client avoids being dismissed. If you're curious to learn more about the breadcrumb method in detail, I break it all down in episode 4 of this very podcast, Scripts and Referrals. That is the difference between leaving an appointment shut down with more questions than answers versus leaving with real momentum. So, let's talk about what happened next, because this is where you get to see the real power of the roadmap in action. Sarah took her script into her appointment with primary care. Interestingly, she actually had one very shortly after we had our initial deep dive session. She raised her exact concerns in the way that we had laid out, the whooshing in her ears, the mismatch between her symptoms and her blood pressure, and whether this could be something vascular or even tied to her autoimmune history. This time, her doctor listened. He listened so well, actually. He fast tracked her to rheumatology, where a specialized CAT scan finally revealed the truth. Sarah wasn't dealing with low blood pressure at all. She had a rare, aggressive autoimmune condition attacking her blood vessels. The medication that she was being given to raise her blood pressure, the only treatment she'd been given up until that point, was actually pushing her closer to the edge every single day. Even with a transfer to a top hospital and the most aggressive treatments available, she couldn't be saved. It's really tempting to think that Sarah's story must be a tragic one-off, but it's not. Johns Hopkins estimates 250,000 Americans die every year from preventable medical errors, and more than 1 million live with permanent complications from missed or delayed diagnosis. Sarah wasn't the exception. She's part of that epidemic. And that epidemic is exactly why Heard for Life exists. After she passed, her family told me they were grateful that we at least got an answer. Without it, Sarah might have just died in her sleep with no explanation. But they also shared their regret, waiting so long to move forward with our services. From their perspective, the delay made sense. She had all the specialists, she'd had so many tests. She followed the doctor's directions to the T. And they assumed, like most people do, that if something serious was going on, it would have been caught. And honestly, at that time, the medical roadmap just felt like an extra expense on top of everything else. And to be frank, like I said at the top of this video, I couldn't answer their biggest questions. What exactly do I get with a medical roadmap? What are you going to do for me if I book one? That's the reason they hesitated. That's the reason they didn't move forward with services until Sarah was in a state of desperation. And I now carry the guilt that if I had been able to answer that question better, maybe we could have uncovered this sooner. Maybe we could have changed her outcome. But that's why I'm sharing her story with you, because maybe it's not too late to help you. This is the hope that I want you to hold on to. When you take action in time, the story changes. You stop wasting energy in endless appointments that go nowhere. You start moving towards real answers instead of being stuck in medical limbo. And with a clear plan, you can focus your energy on living your life, not chasing this broken healthcare system. That's what becomes possible when you have a roadmap guiding the way. And yes, this is an investment in your health that insurance doesn't cover because insurers profit off your chronic illness, not getting you better. But the truth is, there is a cost no matter what you decide. The upfront cost of booking a service like this, or the hidden cost of staying stuck. The copays from endless visits that don't move you forward, the side effects from medications that weren't the right fit, the years of living a half life in medical limbo, or in Sarah's case, the ultimate cost of waiting too long. When you look at it that way, the real question isn't whether you can afford to do this, but whether you can afford not to. If you see yourself in Sarah's story, please don't wait. Go to herdforlife.com/roadmap to book your session. And if you're not sure yet, start with a fit check call. We'll talk. But please don't wait until hindsight is the only clarity you get. Don't you go to another appointment unprepared. Head on over to herdforlife.com/guide and get my free doctor's appointment prep guide so you can start getting the answers you need and get off the medical merry-go-round. I'll see you next week.